What were the consequences of the Mexican War and the Spanish-American War on the United States? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. Welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to be with you and our viewers and listeners, as always.
Yeah, thank you all for tuning in. Richard, I wanted to devote maybe one issue of Libertarian Angle, or maybe two, to two really important wars in the history of this country. And they're wars that are not commonly talked about, but I think they're very, very pertinent, especially in this era of cracking down on illegal immigrants and deporting illegal immigrants, including ones from China and India and other countries around the world to Panama and Costa Rica. Just kind of bizarre. But these two wars have had a tremendous impact on the history of this country. So I thought, we've talked about these wars in the past, but I thought let's devote an entire issue of Libertarian Angle, or maybe two issues. And those two wars are the Mexican War and the Spanish-American War. So let's start out with the Mexican War, and then we'll see how we do on time. The Mexican War I find absolutely fascinating because in this war, the United States, acquired voluntarily the entire northern half, or thereabouts, more or less, the entire northern half of Mexico. Now, this to me is incredible because in all the debates today, you hear this stuff about, oh, the Mexicans are coming in, they're altering our culture, and they're going to destroy the pristine nature of American culture. And I'm sitting there scratching my head thinking, wait a minute. The United States acquired the entire northern half of Mexico. Was that not a drastic change in the culture of the United States? How could it not be? It would be like absorbing the entire northern half of Mexico today. Suppose a new war were to break out, which is entirely possible because President Trump is talking about dropping bombs in Mexico as part of his war on drugs. It's that now he's calling the war on terrorism. And the Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, is saying, you do that, and I can tell you, we will oppose you. Now, I don't know what she means by oppose you, but if there is a war, it's entirely possible that we will absorb the northern half of Mexico again. And with everybody speaking Spanish, and that's the way it was, California, Arizona, New Mexico. Notice the name, New Mexico, Arizona. Now, Texas is a little bit different case, which I'll point out in a minute, but in parts of Colorado, parts of Nevada, this was all Mexico. And everybody spoke Spanish because that was the language of Mexico. It still is the language of Mexico. It was Mexican culture, Spanish culture for centuries. And then all the people that were living here, I don't know the exact number, but certainly tens of thousands of people that were living here who spoke Spanish. That was their language. Are absorbed into the United States automatically as American citizens. Now they had the option of moving back to Mexico, but most of them stayed and immediately were made American citizens overnight with no test on studying the Constitution or anything. I mean, these people had grown up in Mexico under Mexican law, Mexican culture, and now suddenly they're American citizens. So how did all this happen? Well, I started to say Texas is a special case. I was doing a podcast recently where somebody was telling me in the Q&A that Mexico had invaded Texas. Well, Mexico never invaded Texas. I grew up in Texas, and in our public schools, we were required to take history of Texas classes, and so Texas history classes, and so Mexico never invaded Texas. Texas was a northern province of Mexico, and it seceded. And so it's ironic that most Americans supported and do support today the secession of Texas from Mexico, but oppose the secession of the Confederacy from the United States. But I won't digress in that direction. But so Texas secedes, and Santa Anna, the president of Mexico, comes into San Antonio to quell this revolt. And he smashes them at the Alamo, but then he goes to San Jacinto and loses, and he's captured. And so, although the Congress of Mexico never approved the deal he made, the deal was, okay, Texas is now an independent nation. But the southern boundary of Texas was always understood to be the Nueces River, which is north of the Rio Grande. I don't know how many miles, but maybe 50 miles or something like that. It sort of runs parallel to the Rio Grande. Uh, but Texas was claiming that the Rio Grande was the border. Mexico was saying, no, no, no. It's always been understood that Texas as this province, that the Nueces was the southern border. So you had this disputed strip of land between the Nueces and the Rio Grande. And so President Polk says, well, he wants to buy Mexico, like Trump wants to buy Greenland, or acquire Greenland, or the Panama Canal, or Gaza. And well, this is President Polk's mindset too. And Polk says, well, I want to buy the northern half of your country. And Mexico, like Denmark with Greenland and like Panama, says it's not for sale. We're not going to sell you our country. It stands to reason they would take that position. And so Polk says, oh, well, I've got another way to do this. I'll start a war. And once the war is over, that'll be part of the peace treaty where I get this land. So he engineers this provocation by sending troops down into this disputed territory, which was not in dispute as far as Mexico was concerned. It was their land. And so he sends these troops down to Brownsville. And so knowing full well what Mexico was going to do, because this is Mexican land. You've got foreign troops there. So the Mexican troops attack the American troops, and Polk says, oh, declaration of war, goes to Congress, give me a declaration of war because we're now at war. We're innocent. We were just minding our own business. Well, it was all a ruse, because he knew that the U.S. military, even though the United States had a relatively small military force, the United States was not a national security state at that time. No Pentagon, no CIA, no NSA, just a small basic military force. But it was enough to defeat the Mexican army rather easily. And they actually go all the way to Mexico City, and they effect a surrender or a capitulation. And so they negotiate terms. And the terms of the peace treaty is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where Polk gets everything he wanted. He got California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, which arguably may have been already an independent nation, but he got them all. And he ends up with the northern half of the country. Which is very ironic, because today, when Mexicans are crossing the border to come and work, it's like the audacity. How can you illegally come into our country? When it was their country for a lot longer than it has been for the United States. And then you have the other another humorous aspect of this, Richard. And I'll turn it over to you. But the English only crowd, where people say, oh, we should only speak English in America, only speak English in America. Well, the fact is that a lot of people in the borderlands don't speak English. I mean, it shows you how long something like this can take place, the effects of it. For example, in my hometown of Laredo, Texas, which interestingly enough was actually the capital of the Rio Grande, which was part of this disputed area. They seceded too, but Santa Anna smashed them out of existence. But in my hometown, when I went back to practice law in the 70s, we'd have jury panels, and at least 20% of the jury panels that were summoned for jury duty could not speak or write English. And this was just normal. I mean, people, I'm sure there are Americans saying, well, this is terrible after all these decades. But this is what happens when you absorb a foreign country whose language is Spanish instead of English. But notice that the English only crowd, this is what I kind of find funny, is that they were referred to they'll talk about going to San Antonio and then to El Paso and then to visit San Francisco and Los Angeles, instead of saying we're going to visit St. Anthony and then after we go through the pass, we're going to go see the angels in St. Francis, which is the English version of these cities. But that's how long this conquest, that the effects of this conquest have been here in the United States. And so it's when people say we've got to protect our culture, what culture are they talking about, Richard? Are they talking about the culture of my hometown where there's 95% Mexican Americans? Are they talking about the culture in Los Angeles, which probably is like 50% Mexican American? Or are they talking about Chinatown in San Francisco or the French Quarter in New Orleans or Little Italy in New York? It's not real clear. But what is clear is that the conquest of Mexico and the Mexican War had an enormous effect on this country as well as on Mexico and the Mexican people. What do you think?
Well, let me begin with some of your opening remarks. And that is if Donald Trump does invade Mexico or the northern part of Mexico, I'm sure there'll be a lot of international outrage accusing him of violating the international laws of diplomacy and respect for other countries. But he will, I'm sure, have one supporter who will speak on his behalf.
And who is that?
Vladimir Putin will publicly say that Mexico started the war and that the president of Mexico is a dictator, so she can be ignored. So I'm sure that Trump will not stand alone. Anyway, okay, because you have to have at least one friend. It's right. Isn't that what life is about? Friends. Okay. But more specifically on this particular topic, uh, it is clear that what motivated a lot of this was a strong nationalistic bent that was a baggage to the original American ideal of limited government, individual freedom, and non-politicization of human relationships. There was a common attitude in the 19th century of what became known as manifest destiny. America had this duty to become this continent-wide empire, to settle the wild land, to spread civilization, to make a great nation of these unique people of the Americans. And this required expanding the United States from the Atlantic to the Pacific, which obviously included all of those parts of northern Mexico that the United States ended up annexing. And so this itself was an example of imperialism. At that time, the idea of foreign adventures abroad, that is overseas, never really entered very much into American political or nationalist thinking. But this idea that America, the United States, was meant to be this ocean to ocean great nation that would be unique to spreading its special civilization was very dominant. And this played a major factor in this. The same way is that the absorption of Texas after its Declaration of Independence, its defeating Santa Anna and being recognized as independent, was the drive for particularly the southern states for Texas to be brought into the U.S. as a slave state. They wanted to keep a growing balance between those representatives in Congress who were from slave states versus free states, because a number of the Midwest and northern areas were being brought in as states, as free states, and the balance of power in the Congress would be shifted. So they wanted these areas, as they wanted other parts of what became the annexed parts of Mexico to be slave states as well. So there were all these other political and ideological and nationalistic currents at work. But the bottom line is that the United States followed a policy which today is basically abhorred. The idea of invading a country that has not attacked you and to then impose dictatorial terms of settlement that strips a country of some portion, in the case of Mexico, a large portion of its own territory. But this was America basically imposing its imperial designs on a continent. The cultural thing is interesting as well, because I don't see how America could be what it is today if we had not forcefully taken that part of Mexico and been introduced to tacos. What would America be like without tacos? I mean, it, so that makes imperialism having had a benefit just in itself. Because I mean, would you want to just import tacos from Mexico? I mean, we'd have to have a tariff on Mexican-made tacos then. But anyway, it was an example of the spirit of this manifest destiny of just seizing land and basically suppressing people. There was not organized national education back then, but the idea was that an absorbed people would be expected to learn English, to be absorbed into the American culture and political sense of identity. The fact that it did not succeed to a great extent in terms of language and culture, as you're pointing out, just shows the lastingness of culture over politics. Um, uh, this is seen in other parts of the world too, where a conquering nation imposes itself on a people, and as much as their language becomes part of the conquered area, it's very difficult to eliminate the original languages and the cultures. This is seen in Africa, for example. If you go to the Ivory Coast, the official language is a series of the local dialects, but also the common language is French, because France was the imperial power. If you go next door to Ghana, uh, there are the local languages, but English, because of the British presence, is more the common language. But the point is, beneath this are just the tribal languages, the group languages, and these are much more lasting and persistent than anything that a conqueror tries to impose. Now, the only other thing I want to say about this is that this also demonstrates that once these ideas catch hold, and I know we wanted to then take a little bit of time to get to the Spanish-American War. Once these ideas get hold, it is very difficult to control them. If you first believe that it is America's manifest destiny to establish its empire, and they've talked about the American empire, just in the sense of one nation conquering a large territory, um, that once you establish the idea of an empire, in this case from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and it's worthwhile keeping in mind that we almost fought a war with the British over uh, where the boundary line would be drawn between what we now call Washington State and the British call British Columbia and Canada. Uh, Once this was established, then it was not surprising that over the decades, the eyes of conquest went now beyond the continental U.S., but overreached it. In the 1890s, there were several attempts to annex the Hawaiian Islands, which Grover Cleveland opposed, fortunately, when it was first attempted. But then it also created this idea that we needed to spread the United States into perhaps all of Mexico, all of Central America. There was a push to maybe annex Cuba as part of the United States. And therefore, it is not surprising that that beginning steps of conquering a continent leads to the idea of conquering other parts of the world. And that's exactly what happened once in 1898. The circumstances occurred that led to the Spanish-American War, because we talked about Cuban independence, protecting them and helping them overthrow their Spanish rulers and oppressors. But in fact, we for a long time made Cuba an American protectorate for all intents and purposes and imposed a perpetuity of Guantanamo Bay as a U.S. naval base. We annexed Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And then, of course, we set about establishing ourselves as a global empire by annexing the Spanish colony of the Philippines in East Asia. So once this idea catches hold that America has a destiny, a nation has a destiny, it has a mission, it involves the spreading of your territory and your power and your control politically over larger and larger areas, it should not be surprising that once it has begun, it then spreads far beyond where some had originally intended it to stop.
Yeah, I think it's also worth pointing out the aspect of the border after the war was settled with Mexico. That was an open border. I mean, they didn't immediately put up a wall there and said, "Oh, anybody from Mexico, you can't come in to what was your country yesterday." That it was an open border. They may have had a border station or whatever, but there was no control stopping Mexicans from coming in to what had been their country the day before. And this lasted for a long time. The Border Patrol wasn't really established till 1924. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that settled this whole thing was 1848.
Mm.
So for, I don't know, 50 years or longer, an open border was there. In fact, the reason that they called the Border Patrol into existence is because they enacted the Chinese Exclusion Act over on the West Coast that said no more Chinese, because their position was Chinese can never be real Americans because they won't ever look like Americans. So after they finished helping build the Transcontinental Railroad, they said no more, not one single Chinese. And this was a horrific piece of legislation. It lasted for at least 10 years. What the Chinese started to do is go to Mexico and then come across the border because the border was open. And that's why the Border Patrol was established to keep the Chinese from coming across from Mexico. But during that period of open borders, there wasn't any chaos or crisis or death or suffering or people drowning in the Rio Grande or people dying in the backs of tractor trailers or whatever from asphyxiation. There's none of that we see today. There was a harmony. Now, there was a lot of discrimination uh, by Anglos against Mexican Americans. There was no question about that. They stole a lot of their land from them. There was tremendous racial discrimination, but nonetheless, there was harmony between the borders, between the peoples of both nations, because this had been Mexico. This is what we often forget. This was not the United States. This was Mexico, and then the very next day it becomes part of the United States. Uh, and so, yeah, if you then move up toward the Spanish-American War, you see that the statists are really starting to gain control or gain influence in America. We already saw that with respect to regulations, socialism, the Antitrust Act of 1890, minimum wage laws were starting to percolate. The progressives were starting to make progress. But in foreign affairs, the statists were making progress as well. And the notion was America cannot be a great nation, okay, without acquiring possessions. They saw, the British Empire and the French Empire, and if we're going to be a great nation, we have to have overseas possessions. And it's really Donald Trump's mindset today that we can be a greater nation if we acquire Greenland, or if we get back the Panama Canal, if we take over Gaza, we take over other countries around the world, we'll be a great nation. Well, this is empire talk. This is the whole notion of empires, of acquiring possessions. And what happened in the Spanish-American War was really repugnant, because the U.S. comes in, these countries or colonies were fighting for independence from the Spanish Empire and the brutality of the Spanish Empire. All empires are brutal, but the Spanish Empire stood out as one of the more brutal ones. So you've got Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines and others that are fighting for independence. So the U.S. says, oh, we're going to help you. And they believed them, but they were lying. They came in order to replace the Spanish Empire with the American Empire. And this was really the major move toward empire on the part of the United States in order to achieve greatness. So they just lied. They misled all these people thinking, we're here to help you, and they weren't there to help them. They were there to take control over them, to replace the Spanish Empire. And this is the subject of William Graham Sumner's famous essay, The Conquest of the United States by Spain. And what he meant by that is not that Spain won on the battlefield, because clearly the Spanish Empire got defeated, but because they ended up transferring their mindset of imperialism to the U.S. government. And so, yeah, Cuba essentially became a colony. They had troops there till I don't know how many years. That's how the U.S. acquires Guantanamo Bay, this imperial outpost in Cuba. They had a puppet regime there that said, well, if you if you'll give us a lease here for, I don't know, $1 a year or something into perpetuity, we'll take our troops out. So it was a deal that was made under really like extortion. And then there was Puerto Rico. That's how we acquired that possession. And then what I really find fascinating about this whole experiment was the Philippines, because the Filipinos didn't give up. They said, no, wait a minute. We were fighting for our independence, for the freedom to rule ourselves here. And the US says, well, tough luck. That's not going to happen. Well, they didn't give in. And so they kept fighting, this time against the US government. A lot of Americans don't realize this. And so the US military went in there with a ferocity that defies credulity. I mean, they were waterboarding. This is where I think waterboarding became very, very popular. The US troops were waterboarding the Filipino prisoners of war, and these people were just fighting for their own independence. And I don't know how many people were killed there, but my vague recollection was like a million Filipinos killed in this war of independence against the United States. And so, of course, they lose. The U.S. wins, but you had ramifications there too. That you recall that in World War II, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they also attacked the Philippines. And General MacArthur was there with his men, and they were getting surrounded. And of course, the natural question is, what in the heck are American troops doing thousands of miles away in the Philippines to be put in this position? Well, it goes back to the Spanish-American War when the Philippines became a possession of the United States. So you had this horrific consequence many decades later in World War II when MacArthur got out of there, but his men didn't get out of there, and they suffered the Bataan Death March and all the other horrors of being under Japanese captivity. So it's been a horrific two-war system here, Richard, that has led to just horrific consequences for this country.
Well, I should just maybe elaborate a little bit on the Philippine instance. When the Spanish-American War broke out, the U.S. Admiral Dewey had been in Hong Kong with a fleet, American ships. He was sent instructions to sail for the Philippines and attempt to blockade the Spanish ships in Manila Bay and to try to defeat the Spanish. Well, of course, a naval force can't do anything on land. So Dewey sent representatives to speak to the Philippine insurrectionists who were opposing the guerrillas, opposing the Spanish, and they had been opposing the Spanish for quite a while in the countryside. And basically, the deal that Dewey offered is that if they assisted the United States in defeating Spain, Dewey's fleet bottling the ships up and the Filipino guerrillas attacking on the land side, that once Spain was defeated, the United States would sponsor support Philippine independence. But as you say, this was not the course of action the U.S. followed, but instead in the peace treaty annexed the Philippines. Well, of course, the Filipinos felt terribly betrayed and then proceeded to undertake a guerrilla war against the new imperial conqueror, the United States. Now, the Filipino guerrilla leader was a man named Aguinaldo. And this fighting was brutal, particularly, not exclusively, because that would not be fair, but particularly on the United States side. The waterboarding, they would burn villages, they would torture people. Tens of thousands were killed. And then so finally, this was going on 1899, 1900, 1901 into 1902. And so finally, the United States sends a message to Aguinaldo that let's try to sit down and reason together about this. And that let us meet in a neutral place, not occupied by either of our forces. We both will come unarmed and we'll negotiate an end of the fighting. So Aguinaldo and his delegation of supporters show up unarmed. The United States forces show up completely armed and proceed to kill them all.
Wow, I didn't know that.
And that sort of broke the back of the resistance. But the U.S. war tactics, the scorched earth, the torturing, the abuse of prisoners, was so severe and shocking that all American journalists trying to report from the Philippines had severe censorship on all of their dispatches back to American newspapers. In other words, the dispatches were whitewashed of anything that would make the U.S. forces look in a bad or cruel light. And so a lot of the truth about the American conduct during the war only came out after the war was over.
Wow, I didn't know that. Um, well, I know we're out of time, but let me just return back to the Mexican War for a moment. It's not that everybody supported this war. It's my understanding that Abraham Lincoln opposed the war,
Mhm.
and also Henry David Thoreau opposed the war. In
Yes,
fact, I think that's why he went to jail. He refused to pay his taxes.
yes,
They were going to fund the war. Now, you and I have talked about this before, but I think it bears repeating that if Trump does start a war with Mexico, and we end up absorbing the rest of Mexico, the half we didn't steal back in the 1800s, the illegal immigrant problem disappears because
yes, it does.
everybody there now is an American citizen, unless he bulldozes all the people out of there and pushes them into Guatemala or gets other countries to take them because he feels like they would be corrupting American culture. Uh, well, he feels that way now if they come over. So why would he feel any differently if you absorbed the half we didn't steal? Um, but it would be a monumental cultural shift, Richard, if we were to absorb this nation. But it was a monumental cultural shift, one that we're still living with. The fact that we did absorb half of that country.
Mhm,
And I think that's worth reminding Americans of that this was a voluntary act. Nobody
mhm.
forced the United States to do this. It wasn't like they were pushed into a war and pushed into settling this war in this way. They wanted to acquire the northern half of Mexico, and that's what they did.
Yeah, it just shows that uh, the American past has a multi-sided history. It was founded on idealistic principles of individual liberty, the free society, clearly a limited government that was to protect rights and not violate them. Yet other undercurrents have been placed going on in our society. The residues of the slave mentality of the old world that persisted in the southern states, this idea of nationalist conquest that led to this notion of manifest destiny and the taking over of a large part of Mexico, the moving into what today we call Oregon and Washington State, and as I mentioned, almost a war with Britain over where the boundary line would be between Washington State and British Columbia, and then its outreach across the boundaries beyond that. So there have been many parallel forces at work in American history that have sometimes reinforced the ideal of freedom, and others have corrupted it with these various forms of statist and collectivist notions of nation and tribe.
Okay, with that insight, we'll wrap things up. Thank you all very much for tuning in. Thanks for watching Libertarian Angle. Thanks for your great support of FFF as we continue to advance liberty here at the Foundation with our principled approach to advancing libertarianism. Richard, as always, I enjoyed the conversation. Look forward to talking to you next week.